This is Permissionless Liberty.
Hello, everybody. I'm Adam Knott, and I'm joined by Daniel Sanchez, as always. Today, we're going to return to probably the most important document in libertarian history, and that is the Declaration of Independence. And we can't return to that document enough, in my opinion, and possibly Daniel will agree with me. It's just was a remarkable instance in human history, the completion of this document. And so since we talk about it a lot, I'd just like to read the most important passage in the Declaration of Independence to start with. Then I'll make a few little insights about it, and then Daniel will begin the show and start to analyze what he believes is important about the Declaration of Independence. So here's the passage which anybody who wants to study liberty or libertarianism has to know this passage and have parts of it committed to memory. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. So in human history, there is no declaration from a people that's more important than, as Dan and I would agree, that's more important than this passage. Here's 4 just easy insights why I think this passage resonates with people. First, to many people, this passage affirms the existence of a creator. So in that sense, some people can see in this that the creator that they believe in had a hand in creating or in founding the United States. Second, this passage affirms the notion that when government becomes the attacker of its citizens rather than the protector of its citizens, that the citizens have a right to alter or abolish that government. Third, this passage affirms that each individual is endowed with certain inherent rights. And fourth, this passage affirms that government may be erected on a foundation of philosophical individualism as opposed to a foundation of philosophical collectivism. So those are 4 important aspects to this passage that resonate with different people to varying degrees, and which are responsible for making the Declaration of Independence one of the most important documents ever written. So with that, Dan, I understand you have some things you'd like to discuss about this document.
Yes, and I think it's a really good time to discuss it because here in 2026, it is the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, which was signed in 1776. And so it was written a quarter of a millennium ago. So that's also how old the country is, because the signing of the Declaration of Independence really was the inauguration, the founding of America. And it was the document that separated America from the British Empire, and so that established it as a separate polity. And what's remarkable is that this document, this political document, is also kind of like a mini philosophical treatise because it didn't just, declare independence. It justified independence, and it justified it on first principles. It really derived philosophically and logically the America's right to declare independence from the British Empire. And so I think it's really worth studying because it codifies and articulates the founding philosophy of our country, um, the underlying premises of the American experiment. And it's really important to revisit because so many of those premises are forgotten or rejected today. I mean, people give lip service to the founding and to the Declaration, but they don't actually have any kind of agreement with the actual contents of the Declaration of Independence, and especially that first part of the Declaration that you just read, Adam.
Well,
yeah.
Go ahead, Dan.
So yeah, I thought it would be interesting to. I mean, those are great insights about like different aspects that jump out at you about that passage. But I thought it would be good to break it down just like clause by clause, because there's so much to unpack from it that Thomas Jefferson, when he wrote the Declaration of Independence, he packed so much into that initial sentence. There's a book, I forgot the author, but a book that's out now that's called like The Greatest Sentence Ever Written. And it's just about this one particular sentence. And you could even consider that opening sentence, or it's not exactly the opening sentence, but it's one of the early sentences, as sort of like liberty in one sentence, because it not only encapsulates the justification for independence, but also just the freedom philosophy, the prevailing philosophy that of the Americans at the time, and again that our country was founded on.
Just real quick, I think that there's a question in my mind whether the principles that are espoused in this passage are being forgotten or if they're being intentionally ignored. And I think we can make a plausible argument that there's an opposed force to, as we all know, there's the other side of the aisle. There's an opposed force that disagrees with the foundation of our country, and therefore, in the spirit of quote unquote strategic silence, has no interest in bringing attention to the founding ideas of our country. So it's not a coincidence that I don't think it's a coincidence that that the founding of our country and this beautiful document are kind of, as each decade goes on, being emphasized less and less.
Yeah, that's a good point, that it very well may be intentional for a lot of people. Yeah, so just starting out with that first clause, we hold these truths to be self-evident. And really what that is an epistemological claim, like a claim based on the theory of knowledge. And so again, that's just very remarkable for a document like this to begin with epistemology of all things. And so this idea of a self-evident truth, basically it's a truth that, or a claim or a proposition that upon hearing it, its validity is just immediately clear and evident and obvious to the mind, the human mind, that it doesn't need to be um, backed up by any kind of um, any kind of experience. It doesn't need to be, derived by a long chain of reasoning from premises, from a long chain of premises. That it's self-evident. And I was listening to an audiobook of a book I've mentioned before, America's Revolutionary Mind, by C. Bradley Thompson. And he kind of breaks down the Declaration of Independence piece by piece, and he talks about how the way that the founding generation used self-evident, they used it to refer to truths that are just immediately apparent to the mind when you hear it, but also some basic truths that are derived or inferred from that earlier truth. And so that's why, there's kind of like a long string of claims here, and they're all called self-evident, even though some are based on previous claims. And so that's just kind of a little tweak on what we might understand as self-evident. I don't know your epistemology, Adam, but what do you think of this notion of self-evident truths?
Well, I think your insight here is important. If so, we get a little into philosophy here, but for those who are don't look into philosophy very much or aren't familiar, but here's how I would say what a self-evident truth might be. If I were to say to somebody, well, if you look within yourself, look within your own consciousness, and I think it will be self-evident to you if I make the statement that you're always trying to better your condition, or most of the time, or a lot of the time. So is that to Bob, some other person I'm talking to, Bob, isn't it true that you're always trying to better your condition? And Bob thinks about things, and boy, yesterday I was trying to fix my lawnmower, and the day before I went to the doctor to try to cure my illness. And say, yes, Adam, that's okay. I understand. That's a self-evident truth. So they're doing something very similar. They're asking, or they're saying that amongst themselves, that they all believe that it's self-evident that they have been endowed or been given life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. These are things that they all, upon self-reflection, believe that justly are part of who they are as human beings. So it's a call to reflect upon the essence of life, or maybe even the good life, and to say, here's what we're all doing. So why don't we found a government that tries to protect that which we are trying to do, which is we all want to have a life, we all want to have liberty, we all want to pursue happiness. Let's structure a government that furthers that.
Great. Yeah, that makes sense. So then the next clause begins that all men are created equal. So that's the first self-evident truth. And I think it's important to even just look at the individual words, like all men. So, of course, they didn't mean males. Like when people use the word man and men there, they meant humans in general, including
mankind.
Right, including females. And this notion that all men, that it's a universal claim. are created. And so this is a claim about man's nature, that it is created, that that it wasn't existing for all eternity, and the theory of evolution hadn't been developed in 1776 yet, but there is this presumption that humanity has been created and created equal. And I have this article that I published on fee.org called "What the American Founders Meant by Equality," where I go into that. And of course, nowadays, when people hear the word equality, or when they say the word equality, they tend to mean a few things, like a number of things. For one thing, when they say that people are equal, sometimes the more extreme variation of this is that people literally are equal, that there's no variation in human qualities, in human aptitudes, in human abilities, in human character. And so that's very extreme. Another thing that they will often mean is that when that people should have equal outcomes. And one of the reasons why they think they should have equal outcomes is that, like, since they're equal in their abilities and in their productivity and in their skills and aptitudes and character, that if there aren't equal outcomes, that means there must be some kind of injustice going on, some kind of bigotry, some kind of discrimination, some kind of privilege, some kind of exploitation. And so that's why egalitarians, people who believe in equality in these other senses, that they want to level things, that they want to redistribute wealth so that people are closer to equality in their wealth, because any kind of inequality in wealth must be the result of injustice, because otherwise equal people would have equal results, is the idea. Or sometimes even if they don't believe, even if they accept that people are different and have different abilities, that they still think outcomes should be equal anyway. And so that's kind of the range of claims that people who consider themselves egalitarian, that's what they're seeking when they seek equality. Mm-hmm. And a lot of that emphasis on that term equality is because of its equal being in the Declaration of Independence, mm-hmm. and equality being like a lofty ideal to seek. But like you said, sometimes people are ignorant of the founding ideals. Sometimes they know what they were, but they want to twist things. And so that happens with something like the word equality, that even though the founders didn't mean egalitarianism in the modern sense, they will say, like, oh, well, that they did, and that Americans are supposed to be for equality, and so that, like, all of these, like, egalitarian policies they are necessary to realize the American ideal. But again, that's not what the American founders meant by equality. What they meant by equality is what John Locke meant by equality, because the American founders were dyed-in-the-wool Lockeans, and they used a Lockean language when they talked about political philosophy and the premises of political philosophy. And so what Locke meant by equality and by being created equal is what has been called species equality. And that is that humanity, all men, have certain distinguishing faculties. For example, all humans have the faculty of reason. And even if they're like brain damaged and don't have the function of their reason, that the type of being that it is has the capacity for developing reason, even if something was broken and that capacity wasn't developed. But that's still a distinguishing feature of humanity. And that doesn't mean that all people are equally reasonable. It doesn't mean that everyone has the same level of powers of reason, but just the fact that all humans are the same in that they have this capacity for reason. And I think a praxeologist would also say that the distinguishing mark of someone who is a human is that they can act. And Mises would probably say that reason is implication of action, that you can't conceive of action without conceiving of reason. And there are you could also say that man is the moral animal, that humans are able to act and able to use reason and are able to use their reason to guide their action along moral grounds, that they can give themselves rules that they follow, reciprocating with other people, others following those rules too, so that they can live in harmony with those people. And I think it's interesting that Adam Smith talked about how one distinguishing thing about humans is that we can trade. That he pointed out that seems to be something that only humans are capable of doing. That there's reciprocity in a broad sense in throughout the animal kingdom, but no other animal literally like transfers title to Adam Smith used the example, like no one ever saw a dog trading a bone for another bone with another dog. Like it just doesn't happen. And I think that is basically a aspect of our moral capacity, because that's a moral thing, that to recognize someone else's property as properly theirs, that that is a moral action, that you are adopting some kind of code of conduct, some kind of ethic, and really it's only humans who are even capable of that. And so given that we all have these capacities in common, we are equal, we are the same in that sense. And then John Locke then derives that species equality from that species equality, like rights and limited government, and kind of spins his whole political philosophy out of that. And that's exactly what the Declaration of Independence is doing too. That that it's using the species equality of humanity as an axiom from which to derive its philosophy.
Yeah, agreed. And I think from the listener's point of view, the most important thing I think that we're trying to emphasize here is that there's unquestionably two interpretations of the word equality when it comes to our politics. And what the founders meant, the type of equality they were referring to, we could say that we are equal in our humanity. So an example of that might be we all have hopes and dreams. We all have disappointments. We all experience happiness and sadness. And so in that sense, we're all equal. We all have what you could call category equality, meaning that we all understand each other's categories of existence, meaning I know that all the other people that I associate with are care for themselves and their family and their friends, or they hope to make a better living for themselves and the people around them, and that they feel pain or that they want to heal when they're ill. So in a sense, what the founders meant was category equality versus quantitative equality. So to the extent that I can feel sadness and somebody else can feel sadness, we're 100% equal in that respect. But that does not guarantee that the amount of sadness I experience is the same as the amount of sadness somebody else is experiencing. There's no necessity that those two things are equal. So in politics, depending on the type of equality that we're interested in, then we may want to construct a government to protect that type of equality. So the founders, I think, were interested in constructing a government to protect category equality, trying to protect our equality as human beings, but not our quantitative equality, the outcomes, the amount that each of us has of any given part of our life, including property or including abilities. They would have understood and they would have agreed that with regard to quantitative matters, people are not equal. They're equal only with regard to their humanity, or as you said, species equality, but we could also call category equality. But the main takeaway is that there are two clearly defined types of equality. And depending on which you subscribe to, that's going to have a huge influence on your politics.
Yeah, great points. I especially liked what you said about sadness, that you could also say that, even though we all have the capacity to be sad, some of us may be more prone to depression than others. And but that doesn't change the fact that we all have the capacity for sadness. And yeah, that's a great way of looking at it.
Yeah, we empathize with other people based on what we know they can go through based on our own experience, being happy, being sad, having aspirations, being disappointed. So that's our common humanity. And then we empathize with our fellow human beings based on our common understanding. But if I suffer some unhappiness or anguish, we don't believe that my anguish that I experience today because I failed to pass an exam is the same anguish in quantity as somebody else who may experience some other tragedy in their lives. So we're not equal quantitatively, but we are equal in our humanity to experience things, all the same things on a category basis. It's a little, that word sounds a little scary and a little philosophical, but it's an appropriate word, I think.
Yeah. And we have to look at what Locke was trying to infer, or the question that Locke was trying to answer from the observation that of human equality. And that is the question of whether some individuals had a right to subordinate or subjugate other individuals. And so for example, well, let me just say that what his answer is that, like, since we are created equal, since we all have species equality, the way he put it is that our creator did not set apart any of us to be subjugators or subordinators of other people. That our creator didn't give any of us like a clear distinguishing mark that, like, okay, well, this should be the master class and this should be like the slave
Mm-hmm.
class.
Mm-hmm.
And
well, Dan, if I may, I mean, in a sense, what and this is all new. I hadn't thought about this, but now that we're getting to this discussion, it's almost the sense that, in the same way that as a human, I pursue happiness. So therefore, I'm categorically equal to other people who are pursuing happiness. So we're equal, both chasing happiness. What Locke's saying is liberty. He's interpreting liberty as another category equality. In other words, I have liberty to pursue my happiness. And if all men are created equal categorically, then you must have liberty to pursue happiness. Because if we're categorically equal and I claim liberty as a category of my existence, then you must obtain liberty as a category of your existence. So he, in a sense, I could interpret him to be saying that liberty is one of the categories of our humanity that has been endowed or indelled in our deepest, in the meaning of our lives, just as happiness and sadness, and liberty as a category quality. I mean, maybe you don't see it that way, but it just struck me that maybe it's trying to see it as a fundamental part of being human is being at liberty or having liberty.
right. Yeah, and I mentioned what Adam Smith said about dogs, like dogs not being able to trade. And I think that aspect of dogs and like the fact that they just don't have the capacity for morality that humans have, that marks them, that the creator has marked them as not equal to humans. And that is a distinguishing mark that makes it make sense that humans would be the masters of dogs. Because I mean, even if you just follow the reasoning that, animal rights activists notwithstanding, that you try to imagine a world in which we tried to give equal rights to dogs, and just like how nonsensical that would be. And so, and then Aristotle believed that there were like natural slaves and natural masters. But Locke thought he was wrong, and that Aristotle thought that there were certain distinguishing characteristics, but you know, but Locke's criteria was species equality, and however different any one individual is from another person, they still have the same basic attributes. And even if like one type of person has superiority in one attribute, they might have inferiority in another attribute. And what's most important, I agree with Locke, is whether we have the same basic faculties. With dogs, they don't, but with other human beings, no matter how you know you know bad of readers they are, or bad of thinkers, or and of course, again, when these human faculties are impaired to such an extent where people can't even take care of themselves, I don't think that they have any less rights, but people can't just lord it over them and just use them however they want. But I think there's a certain like custodial rights that people who need to take care of cognitively impaired people are able to do, and just in the same way that parents that can make decisions for their children. But for adults who are not impaired to the extent where one of the a key faculty is just eradicated, that no matter how much smarter one is to the other, or how much more skilled one is to another, or how like virtuous one is to another, that they're still basically the same, like the same species, the same category, like you say. And that there's no way of distinguishing like a master class. And
Well,
so
I mean,
yeah, go ahead.
I think when you're talking about somebody with diminished capacities, that's just a person who is categorically equal, but not quantitatively. So, in other words, I think the Locke's concept that we're talking about is that our common humanity, and categorically meaning each person can experience sadness and happiness, and each person has the faculty of reasoning, but that could be run the gamut from the most intelligent, physicist or whoever you think is intelligent in the world, down to the person who really struggles with very basic thinking. So to me, I don't see a problem with somebody with diminished capacity, because we just assume that they have the same human faculties, even if it's in a diminished capacity. They're still equal in their humanity, or as you call it, species equal or categorically equal. And that's what I think the founding fathers were constructing there, or Locke was constructing his philosophy on. Anyway, I'll leave it at that.
Well, I mean, if someone was in a coma, they don't really have powers of reason at all. And so I think in that case, people who do have reason can make decisions for the coma victim, but as like trustees and custodians, because there's still something sacred about the coma victim, because they still have like the potential for reason, because like there's still of such biology, or still of such like history, that they were born of humans, and that, like, if the accident didn't happen, or if the disease didn't happen, that they could have, they could be thinking, and maybe they could think again someday. And so we can't just kill them or do whatever we want with them. We have to act as trustees, and because it's that's similar to, like, infants, that there are certain things there are certain faculties that infants just can't do yet, but they have the potential to. And so, parents have caretaker rights. They can't do whatever they want to them. Um, but and they can't, the reason why they can't do whatever they want to them is because that they are, sacred human beings who have the capacity to, grow up into to become adults with full human faculties.
Well,
That's the way I see it.
okay. I guess the way that's where we maybe see it in a different way. The way I see it is that my relationship to the government becomes problematic for me when, as the values that I hold more and more dearly become under attack from my government. So then I start to try to protect myself from a government that's trying to attack me. And so when you have borderline cases, such as how to separate human consciousness from animal consciousness, or a difficult a gray area medical decision, or a gray area international relations decision, which are removed from my direct relationship with the government, the way I see it is that if I were ever to have a government that reflected my values, all of those three different borderline cases, or different difficult cases, would take on a different character. So to me, I personally don't believe that I have to focus on the difficult philosophical issues that come up in a legal setting under the current structure of government, which I am not in favor of, since that's just downstream of that form of government, because those things are imposed upon us. In other words, the international relations that my government has, or the relations that I have with other people, is dictated by my government now. So for me, I don't have a lot of interest in trying to figure out borderline cases that happen now, but based on that structure. My main contention is that if I'm successful in having a kind of government as the kind we're talking about, that was founded 250 years ago, that difficult cases would now be under a different light, and I'm going to have trust that maybe those would be better. So if I had a libertarian government, maybe we wouldn't have the interventionism we have today, and maybe the way medical decisions were decided would be different if we had a libertarian government. So therefore, I'm really interested in the Declaration of Independence that deals specifically with how my government relates to me, and trying to adjust it so it relates to my well-being. After which, a whole bunch of other issues that are cloudy right now might start to resolve in a certain direction based on a liberty structure. And if they don't resolve and they still become difficult, everybody still has the freedom to pursue the resolution of those. But anyway, so enough said on my part.
Yeah, fair enough. So the next part of that Declaration passage is that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. And so this notion of endowed by their Creator, that the way I see that is that God created us as we are, gave us our nature, and created each individual as having the same basic human nature, having that species equality. And given these qualities, humans flourish together better with certain rights. And so I think that's how our creator signaled or revealed the way we should treat each other is by creating us with a certain nature. I believe that through what's called special revelation, like in the Ten Commandments, the prohibitions of murder, thou shalt not murder, thou shalt not steal. I mean, that's basically a declaration of individual rights, of property rights and self-ownership. And but in addition to special revelation, there's what's called general revelation. And I believe that by creating us as we are, and by giving us the nature that we have, that philosophers and economists like John Locke and Adam Smith, that they were able to analyze that nature and figure out the social norms and rules by which humans with this nature flourish together. And so they were able to discover our God-given rights by studying general revelation. So like, Randians, objectivists, that they're very atheist, that they take issue with putting the creator in the argument for liberty. But I don't. And I think that it's, consistent with like natural rights philosophy, using reason and not special revelation, just to reason from general revelation, as well as utility, because that's how we know that something is natural, is by seeing like whether we thrive and flourish under certain norms. And by seeing whether something is natural, we're seeing whether it is in accordance with our God-given nature. And so then we're seeing whether it was according to God's design. So I have this Substack post called Liberty is Natural, Practical, and Divine. And I elaborate on that in that post.
Well, my comment on that is that I think the founders were kind of genius in that they did use the word creator, and while that legitimately has certain meaning to, people who are traditionally religious, it does leave the door open a little bit to a slightly different interpretation, at least to the extent that one wouldn't feel excluded by that term. And I'm one of those people. I don't feel that term does not offend me. And to me, it means I could interpret it as, by whatever means I came to be here today, I have been endowed with certain faculties. And from there, those faculties tell me what my other fellow citizens also are endowed with. And if I think something's fair or right or just for myself, then why wouldn't they believe the same kind of thing is fair or just or right for themselves? And why shouldn't I believe that? So that I could agnostically, I guess, build my own understanding of the document, which I do in fact do, as speaking to me as somebody who has been created. It's a fact that I have been created, and it is a fact that I have been endowed with certain faculties. From there, I make the assumption that my fellow citizens have been endowed with the same faculties. They have, if you want to call it species equality or category equality with me. So if I don't feel good when somebody tries to coerce me or lie to me, then why would I think it's a good thing if I coerce them or lie to them?
Yeah, this is the
To me,
golden rule.
it's so obvious. And so I just want to say that as a non-practicing traditional religious person, a person who does not practice traditional religion, I'm comfortable with our genius founders and the way they worded this document to be open-minded enough to not solve the problem of the creator in this document, but to say that we have been created, and we are endowed with certain qualities or aspects of our consciousness or soul, and then we're going to try to see what does that mean for our government. The fact that we as a species have these qualities, then what should we do? And they proceeded to outline a system to maybe protect the most sacred of those qualities.
Indeed. Yeah, and again, it's kind of like a syllogism, this part of the Declaration of Independence, that, one clause will be the premise for the conclusion of the next clause. And so where it says all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights, those two self-evident truths aren't just separately claimed, that rights are derived from equality. Now, Thomas Jefferson didn't, elaborate on that derivation, but it's drawn from John Locke, and John Locke did elaborate that derivation. So John Locke wrote in the second treatise of government, or in the two treatises of government. Where's this quote? Sorry, I had it.
Was it in
here it
the
is.
article?
Yes. He wrote, being all equal and independent, no one ought to harm another in his life, health, liberty, or possessions. So that's where he derives from equality, being all equal, to rights.
Mm-hmm.
No one ought to harm another in his, and then he lists rights,
Mm-hmm.
life, health, liberty, or possession. And so, he argued that being all equal, that we should also be, quote, should also be equal one amongst another without subordination or subjection. And what that looks like in practice is, people living according to the golden rule. And the golden rule encompasses basically respecting each other's rights, respecting their person and property. And so, yeah, that the rights to person and property really are the only reciprocally equal way you could organize society, um, because there are clean edges with something like positive rights, like welfare rights, like a right to like 3 square meals a day. You know, that presumes that one person has the right to force someone else to provide them with 3 square meals a day. And that means that that person, you know, is limited in their use of their labor and their property because someone else has a claim to that. So it's only with rights to person and property where it's like, okay, Adam, you can have your right to your body and I can have my right to my body. And there's no logical conflict there.
Mhm.
And you can have your right to your microphones and I can have my right to my microphone, and there's no conflict there, and we could trade if we wanted. But so that's really this Lockean formulation of rights is the only way that humans can live without subjugation and subordination. And Locke, figured that, given that there's no like master class, like the way Thomas Jefferson put it is that, some of us are not, born with boots and stirrups and other people born with saddles, and like, for one person to ride the other legitimately. Um, Given that, we should treat each other equally, and the only way to do that is through classical liberal rights.
I don't have a lot to add. I was trying to think if I could add something important to that, but let's just go on next. I don't have a good one right for you there.
Okay. So the next clause are those on the certain inalienable rights. Not all of them, because he says that among these are. So he's not, Thomas Jefferson isn't, pretending to give an exhaustive list here. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And, John Locke's more classic formulation is life, liberty, and property. And I'm not sure why they, replace property with the pursuit of happiness, but I think it's just important to note that that doesn't mean that, the founders didn't believe in the right to property. And I think one piece of evidence for that is that the classic formulation of life, liberty, and property is in a lot of other founding documents, in a lot of like state constitutions and state bills of rights. And I think it's important to note that this derivation of rights, that again, it's really following closely on John Locke. And so you have to infer that basically what the founders meant by these things is what John Locke meant. And what John Locke meant by rights is essentially ownership. Because he wrote that, let me find the exact quote. So this is in my article, another article that I published called "What Are Rights? This is What the American Founders Believed." let me find it here. I used the word property a lot. Every man has a property in his own person. This nobody has a right to himself. And so, a lot of times in current language, when people say property, they mean like external goods and services. But John Locke meant by property, like anything that is proper to a certain person, that is properly owned to a certain person. So when he says every man has a property in his own person, that actually refers to like the human body. And then he also talks about possessions and estate. So there he's talking about property as also encompassing external goods. And so that is ultimately what John Locke meant by rights. That life, the rights to life, means is derived from your right to own your person. Because if someone murdered you, that would be them claiming a right to your person, that they could just shoot you if they wanted to, that they could dispose of your body the way that they wanted to. And so the right to life is just an aspect of the right of self-ownership, because if you want to keep your body free of bullet holes, that you have a right to do that, and someone who fills your body with bullet holes is violating that right. Similarly, the right to health. So he talks about the right to health. If you didn't die from those bullet holes, they would still be violating your right to your body, because they would be using your body the way they want to use it, and to great detriment to your health, that even if you didn't die from it, then you would be in a lot of pain and possibly crippled. And so the right to health is also just an implication of the right to the ownership of your own body. And the right to liberty, like life, health, liberty. The right to liberty is also the right of your own body, that if someone kidnapped you and locked you in their basement, then they're also claiming the right to dispose of your body the way they want. And so that's why these things like murder and assault and kidnapping are considered crimes, because they're a violation of our rights to life, health, and liberty, which is all stems from our ownership of ourselves, of our bodies.
Now we're getting into, a little bit of a complicated libertarian, what I consider complicated libertarian rights theory. And so this is where I think we have what the founders wrote, and then we also have libertarian scholarship, let's say, that libertarians have been engaged in the, let's say, in the modern times since 1950. And I find that difficult in certain ways. For example, there's an idea where there's certain categories of my existence that, assuming I'm still alive, nobody can kind of take away from me. So if I can experience happiness or sadness, or if I can move my own body, those are kind of things that are part of my humanity that can't be taken away, even if somebody wants to. But what they can take away is the quantitative aspect. They can influence how much sadness or happiness I experience, and they can dictate how much I can move my body. They can imprison me, so therefore I can only move a few feet left and right, or they can severely harm me and make my sadness increase. But when we try to mix those two, if we try, I would just say as a philosophical principle, if we try to mix the concrete, which is subject to quantitative measurement, with the categorical aspect, that's where philosophy gets complicated or difficult. And so I guess what I said, half an hour ago is that I'm almost of the mind that the framers were trying to incorporate some of our quantitative existence as part of our categorical existence, such that if I have used my labor to cultivate a piece of land and built a house on it and planted cherry trees, that now that's should be a part of me in the same way that my humanitarian categorical aspects are part of me. And to take those pieces of property away from me are the same as if you were to take the other categorical aspects away from me, such as the ability to experience happiness or sadness, or the ability to move my own body. But it was difficult because the categorical aspects of me, you can't take away from me. You could kill me, but while I'm alive, they can't be taken away from me because it's just part of being a human being is to have those. Whereas my material or quantitative existence definitely can be taken away from me or diminished. So I guess I see the framers as attempting a valiant attempt to claim or to try to establish that the material parts which we have accumulated to ourselves through morality, through moral activity, should be considered just as if they were part of our humanity. And I think that therefore, to the extent that argument is weak and difficult to maintain, that is a weak point that an opposition party who doesn't believe in the founding documents can attack. But I'm not arguing that, Dan, that you're not right in your explication of what they're doing. I guess I'm just commenting on what I consider to be the difficulty of understanding what they meant, because to me it's so clear the categories of my consciousness or of my being. To me, I feel I can clearly distinguish from the quantitative or material aspects, and so the material or quantitative aspects are the part that the opposing party is going to come after me. They're not going to extinguish my humanity. They're going to imprison me or take all my stuff. And those are the parts that they can take away from me, actually, which they have done, which they do.
Yeah, and I think that consciousness is definitely part of human nature, but a huge part of human nature is also that on Earth, on the earthly plane, in the material world, that the only way that a consciousness can pursue its values, pursue its happiness, is through the use of material things, of the consciousness's own material body and external property. And I think maybe that's why Jefferson used pursuit of happiness instead of property, like recognizing that the only way that people can pursue their ends, pursue their purposes in this world is through the use of property, that you need standing room to even for your body to even be in. Um, you need earth to cultivate, either you or someone that you contract with, or someone that, through a chain of exchanges indirectly contracted with, so that that can produce, food. And um and the right to life is nothing without a right to livelihood, and a right to livelihood implies a right to property, because that's the only way that you can even have livelihood. um and so I, I I think it is important to recognize that the founders did believe in a right to property. And basically what John Locke, the way John Locke characterized it, is that human beings have a right to appropriate unowned land and other things in nature. And the way he put it is mix your labor with the land, or you could just call it working the land or improving upon nature, and turning something natural into something man-made, into something artificial, and more conducive to human endeavors. And that when you do that, that you're laying your claim to that thing, and that thing becomes your property. And then once that is your property, that you have title to it, but that you can transfer that title to, um, anyone you like, either as a gift or, um, in exchange, as a trade, with the understanding that your transfer of title to this other person is is conditioned on a reciprocal transfer of title of some other, um, owned thing that they own. Um, and and that's basically it. That's basically the the right to your body. That, on the other hand, is considered unalienable. That you can't sell yourself into slavery, for example. And also, you can't, even though you can alienate farmland that you homesteaded, you can't alienate your right to homestead land. Um, I think that's the way Murray Rothbard explained it. And so these two sets of rights, self-ownership and ownership of possessions, that, for one thing, that's what defines crime. So similarly, vandalism and theft and trespassing, like those are all based on the right to property. And but also that's basically what all other rights are derived from, are those two basic rights. And um so then Locke goes on to derive, the rights of the citizen with regard to their government. Um but it's all grounded on that. So that's kind of like the next chain of reasoning is, Locke has reasoned from equality to rights.
Well, I, I'd like to provide a slightly different interpretation, because if I read this passage right now, and it says that men are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, and we said that among these are life, liberty, and property, I think that's immediately problematic, because that would be a plain statement that every living human has a right to property. So if a person, a clothless person came out of the mountains with no property, someone could look at that person and say, well, he has no property. Well, he has a right to property. So that would imply that the injustice had been done to him. That's being facetious. But you would have to say then that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of property would be more plainly acceptable. But then it would be trite, because it would say that the sacred rights of mankind are to pursue material ends, and you would have sullied, in my opinion, the most sacred document, the most sacred passage, that it's the right of man to pursue a picket fence on his farm, and to pursue a sturdy farmhouse, and to pursue the ownership of several horses. So to me, Jefferson was correct in saying the pursuit of happiness. And so he basically used three abstractions, which in your pursuit of happiness, if you're left alive and you're left to pursue your happiness, and you're left the liberty to pursue happiness, you're going to be acquiring property. So if you leave me at liberty, I'll take care of the property. If you extinguish my liberty, you're going to severely extinguish my ability to acquire property. So again, I guess I feel that, notwithstanding libertarian propertarian theory of the last 3 or 4 decades, that I'm not a proponent of, I side with Jefferson in his phraseology, and I vote with him to not put in this declaration that an unalienable right of man is property.
Well, I think that Jefferson was a propertarian, but I think you make a good point about the misreading that one could open oneself up to by asserting the right to property, especially in such a short passage. Because John Locke wrote about life, liberty, and estate, or life, liberty, and possessions. And, even that could be misconstrued as like, okay, well, I don't have possessions. John Locke said I have a right to possessions, so I have a right to your possessions. But of course, like, John Locke wasn't, he was writing a whole 2 treatises, not just one declaration. And so it would be hard to misread that, because he elaborated what he meant by rightly owned possessions, that he meant possessions that were, homesteaded or gifted or traded. And so I don't think it's a philosophical difference between Locke and Jefferson. I think it's more Jefferson trying to avoid misunderstanding.
Well, fair enough. And succeeding in that, I guess. And just deciding to include the loftiest ideals, and maybe bypassing a more controversial ideal about Marx's famous property relations, that including trying to incorporate a tangible, because in this plainest meaning, property is a tangible. Doesn't have to be tangible, but in its plainest meaning, property refers to tangible possessions, and kind of choosing not to incorporate that in the stated document of our principles of political organization, and leaving the property relations as a subsidiary, secondary, downstream feature that is to be determined after you leave me, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. When I go to trade with my fellow citizens, whether I have property or not, or how much property I have or how little, will be determined through my interactions with my fellow citizens.
Yeah, and so then the next clause is that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. And so that is also something that a lot of modern people would disagree with, because, you know, today we have a very expansive role for government, that, you know, government can do all kinds of things. Government can help us get into space, and government can, you know, feed us and tend to us when we're sick, and make us better people. And, you know, part of it is, again, a twisting, just as in egalitarians twisted what was meant by equality, that modern quote unquote rights proponents twist what was originally meant by rights. And so, for example, that there are welfare types of rights, that, like, you know, a right to 3 square meals a day, a right to health care, even a right to internet, all these things. Or there's like identitarian rights, of where they talk about like identity groups that have people think been oppressed in some way, either because of inequality of outcome, or because unequal treatment. And so, you know, they believe that government needs to secure those rights by, you know, forcing equal pay, or forcing you to bake a cake for a gay wedding. And again, that's completely antithetical to what the founders understood as rights, because the founders would believe that an employer has a right to their money, and has a right to make a voluntary contract with a woman worker for whatever terms they agree on. And that a Christian baker has property rights in his ingredients for baking a cake. And so to assert like women rights and gay rights such that they impinge on property rights, like, you know, that's obviously not what the founders were talking about. And so what the function of government is actually to do is to secure rights. That if somebody was trying to force someone to fork over more money, or to fork over a cake, that the government's role is to stop that coercion, stop that extortion or theft, or whatever kind of crime it is. So basically that, you know, government is meant to is to be a crime fighter. Like, to secure rights is to be a crime fighter, is to secure the right to life by stopping and prosecuting in the courts, with police and with a court system, murder and assault, as an infringement on the right to life, and assault as an infringement on the right to health, and kidnapping as an infringement on the right to to liberty, and theft and extortion and vandalism and trespassing as infringements on the right to possessions or estate, as Locke put it, or as we'd put it, property. And what the Declaration of Independence says is what John Locke said, is that that's the whole raison d'etre of government. That's its reason for being. That's its purpose, is to secure those rights, and that's its only job.
Mm-hmm.
And again, that's super radical compared to the way we see, like radically minimalist compared to the way we see the role of government is today.
Well, have you heard it? What you're talking about, Dan, referred to as positive versus negative rights. You remember somebody mentioning it, phrasing it in that way?
Mm-hmm.
In other words, that what the framers or founders were interested in is the negative rights. In a sense, if I'm not harming anybody, then the government should not interfere with me. The rights weren't meant a positive obligation on my part to secure some level of existence for another person. That the rights were a negative or a prevention on intervention, basically, not an invitation or an obligation on my part to provide a service. So the framers were interested in the negative rights or rights against the government, and that the government could only intervene in my life in very limited circumstances when it was warranted, when I had done something quote unquote wrong. And in their thinking, wrong would have been committing a crime, and the crime committed is not just not doing what the law says. The crime is what I call a universal crime. It's those things that nobody wants to be the recipient of. So it's murder, fraud, assault, all the things that everybody universally does not want to be on the receiving end of. Those are the crimes that they're trying to prevent. Whereas today, a crime is any written legislation that you transgress. So it's a manufactured crime. For example, I could make a crime to say that anybody who has a bedroom should not have more than 2 doors on the bedroom. And if they have 3 doors in their bedroom, they're committing a crime. So legislated crime, meaning it's made up in the legislature, but it's not universal that everybody in the world is trying to avoid 3 doors on their room. So it's not a universal crime. It's just a legislated crime. And the founders, I think, were more interested in universal crime. And that's the basic libertarian intuition. I heard somebody online on YouTube the other day, an Englishman, and he was just talking about his conception of libertarianism. And he said, well, if I'm minding my own business and doing my own thing, then nobody should interfere with me. So of course it's easy to say, then you have to try to found a government on that, and then a whole bunch of difficult cases arise and have to be decided judicially. But the basic libertarian impulse is the same: to secure those rights, the right for me to proceed without intervention. Governments are instituted among men. So I join with my fellow citizens, and we collectively try to protect each other's right to proceed without intervention, as long as all of us agree to follow certain moral rules, not to commit murder, not to commit fraud, assault, all the what I would call universal crimes. That was the foundation, the libertarian foundation of our country.
That's right. And it's a lot of times people will think it's an anachronism to talk about the libertarian foundations of our country, because people think of libertarianism only was used in the way it is now, like starting in like the 60s or so, the 1960s. But aside from the word, like the meaning, like what libertarians are talking about today is basically what the founders were talking about, and what John Locke was talking about. And so it's just a different label is all. And
Definitely.
and so then the next passage, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. And so, the governed, the idea is that, the government is for the sake of the governed. And that the governed, they have their right to defend their own rights. They have a right to self-defense, and they have a right to restitution. And then the idea is that they delegate their self-defense and restitution to a government to secure their rights on their behalf. But that delegation is always revocable. That they can always withdraw their consent.
Mm-hmm.
And so this was just a very revolutionary, literally revolutionary idea of the nature of government, because previously, government was the master and the subjects were the servants. But this just completely turned that upside down, that like it's the governed who are to be served. And it is the government that is supposed to serve. It's a servant government, not a master government. And so that was,
we sent you there to protect us. If you're not going to protect us, we have to make other plans.
exactly. Yeah. And then that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its power in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. And so this notion of a government being destructive of the ends of securing their rights is, very important, because it's one thing that government can do is it can just fail to secure rights. So like it could, not answer when you call 911, and it can just fail to arrest murderers and to stop thieves and things like that. And that's bad enough. But it's really destructive of the ends of securing rights when government itself murders and steals and does the very things that it was instituted to prevent, to stop, to combat. And yeah, this, like Frederick Bastiat, that's the way he characterized it. That he called it a perversion of the law. The law perverted, turned against, it commits the very acts that it was supposed to combat.
It's not protecting your rights, it's violating your rights.
Exactly. And so when that happens, people again have a right to self-defense and to restitution. And so if something that they created to secure their rights has gone rogue and is systematically violating their rights, well, they have a right to withdraw consent and abolish that government and to make new arrangements to secure their rights. And so here, that's where Thomas Jefferson closes the initial chain of reasoning to justify the independence that this document was declaring, because their argument is that the British government was violating the very rights that they were supposed to be defending and securing for the Americans, and so that they were justified in separating from that government and to create its own government. And it's just so remarkable that in such a small space that Thomas Jefferson started from an epistemological foundation to then make a observation about human nature, and from that observation derive rights, and from the understanding of rights derive the proper role of government, and from understanding the proper role of government, the right to revolution, basically. And so grounding this Declaration of Independence as philosophically rigorously and morally rigorously as possible.
Well, I have, yeah, I mean, it was an amazing passage. I did have some insights on it, Dan, but I didn't know if you had.
Please.
I think what was really fascinating about this Declaration of Independence and the passage we're talking about today is that, as I had written in my remarks, it's kind of an affirmation that a theory of government can be structured or can be erected on the basis of philosophical individualism. And when I say that in the context of what we're talking about today, I don't mean that in the sense of selfishness. What I mean is what the founders are saying is that the individual has certain qualities, certain faculties, and the government will protect those faculties and let the individual pursue each their own view of happiness. And the material outcome of that pursuit is not the concern of that philosophy. It's left to each individual to be concerned with the material results of their pursuit of happiness and the interaction of the different people in society. So basically it says, here are your faculties. We're going to protect you. Go out in the world and try your best to care for yourself and your family and your loved ones. That doesn't tell you not to be concerned with your fellow human being, but it basically leaves it to your moral sense whether you're concerned with other people and to what extent. It's optional for you. So the way to say that would be it's secondary. The primary value is your life, your liberty, and your pursuit of happiness as an individual. We're here to protect all you individuals. Our theory of government will protect all your individuals and try to prevent each one from murdering the other or stealing from the other. But the material end result of the pursuit is not our proper function. That's the claim that they made, and that's what's so unique about it.
Yeah, Ayn Rand made the same point in her, I think her essay, "The Nature of Government," that you have a right to the pursuit of happiness, not to the achievement of it.
Right. And so I wrote down here So, and using what you had written in your articles, a moral imperative of libertarianism, just a general one. This isn't meant to, so we nitpick over the words, but no one ought to violate an individual's right to their life, liberty, property, etc. I did put in property, by the way. That's the libertarian moral imperative. But people and governments, in fact, do violate an individual's right to life, liberty, and property. So with this analysis, it starts with the individual, and as I mentioned, the outcomes are not specified. What each individual's rights are the primary function, and the outcomes of the individual's pursuit are secondary values. It's not that we don't have to be concerned with them. If I see a poor person, or if a family member of mine is struggling, or my next door neighbor is struggling in some way, or even a stranger is struggling in some way, individualism and libertarian rights theory does not preclude me from helping that person, but it doesn't legislate that I help that person. And that is where we come into conflict with the opposed philosophy of collectivism, because the fundamental starting point of collectivism is not the rights of the individual, but a comparison between individuals. So, as I would maintain, the starting point of collectivist political philosophy is a comparison between people or between groups. And this comparison is the explicit starting point of collectivism. And the relative outcomes between people and between groups is the primary concern, and the individual then it becomes secondary. So if the flip side of the moral imperative of libertarianism is the moral imperative of collectivism, which would be something like no person or group should be allowed to persist in having better outcomes than any other person or group. But in fact, some people and some groups do persist in having better outcomes than other people or groups. So the foundation or moral rule of collectivism is that a person must proceed with regard to comparative outcomes. In other words, it explicitly prohibits one from something that libertarian political philosophy specifically allows, which is, may I proceed to pursue my own happiness in my own way without regard to comparison with my fellow citizens, or must I only proceed with regard to the comparison of relative outcomes between myself and my fellow citizens? So in collectivism, proceeding without regard to comparative outcomes is immoral. So to me, that's the significance of the Declaration of Independence as a document founded on individual rights, where I'm viewed as having rights that the government must not interfere with unless I commit a universal crime. And the philosophy that opposes that says, no, you have obligations that if you do not fulfill, you have positive obligations to fulfill towards society, that if you don't fulfill them, that will be a crime. So it's an upside down, really the inverse of libertarian social philosophy.
Well, this is a great conversation. One thing I'll add is that it's important to remember that even though, rights as the founders conceived it is not consistent with entitlements and with rights to certain provisions, that it doesn't mean that in a rights-specific, rights-protecting environment in a libertarian society that people go without provision. It's just that it's voluntarily provided. And and the thing is that production and commerce and charity all just thrive so much better in a free society, and that when you try to force charity on people, and when you try to centrally plan production, then people end up being less well provided for, and it just extinguishes the heart of charity, and it stomps on the innovation to stomps on the incentive to produce, and the ability to produce, and the ability to even coordinate your production with everyone else, because there's without property there's no there's no prices, and without prices there's no economic calculation, and without economic calculation there's no global division of labor. But that's a subject for another podcast. Adam, I really enjoyed this talk. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. I enjoyed it too.